Hi, this is module 8. Welcome to this module. I'm Ragnhild. I hope everyone is well. This module is about dilemmas of research ethics in humanitarian contexts. The learning outcomes for this module are related to you having knowledge on humanitarian settings and humanitarian principles, recognizing issues related to deciding research priorities when resources are limited and when there are humanitarian needs. We also expect you to be able to reflect critically on research that is planned or carried out in humanitarian settings, and to be familiar with some guidelines and resources on research in humanitarian settings. Again, I will be using some examples from mental health psychosocial support, but these are applicable also to many other fields, and not least to address power imbalances between researchers and participants. Humanitarian contexts are contexts where there are emergencies or conflicts or acute lack of resources, so that the normal resources are insufficient and other help is needed, humanitarian need, often from international actors. This reflects the urgency of such contexts. However, many humanitarian contexts are protracted and go on for a very long time. These contexts are often very complex because there are several hardships, several needs at the same time. This could be conflicts, could be natural disasters, it could be poverty, it could be poor governance, lack of functioning infrastructure, lack of school government systems, etc. And the more of these elements you have, the more complex the context is. And in such context, there is nearly always great power inequalities because the needs are so great, and some people or organizations have access to resources that are needed by others. Therefore, in such context, there is a potential for causing harm, and this must be considered from the outset, from the beginning, in any planning and implementation and follow-up of research. So this places a lot of responsibility on the researcher and on the funding organizations. Because when there's a lack of infrastructure, for example, lack of functioning ethical committees or ways to report abuse, for example, or lack of trust in the government or in police or in university systems, these again increase vulnerability. The picture here is from work I did many years ago during the war in Bosnia in Europe, which is one of those situations that have a lot of vulnerabilities for people and groups. Power inequality increase the risk of abuse, and this has to do with unequal access to resources between those doing research and the communities and the people who take part in research as participants who are subject to research. And in addition, if you work on personal or sensitive topics, then we have to pay particular attention. The example here that I've used to illustrate is just from a WHO program in Democratic Republic of Congo, where those who were supposed to provide aid actually were accused of and found to some extent guilty of abusing their power and trading sex and food, which is of course horrendous, but it shows that these situations can occur in any organization. Most agencies, such as the UN agencies, the Red Cross, non-governmental organizations, adhere to humanitarian principles. So these humanitarian principles are at the core of, or the basis of, a lot of humanitarian action. They include, they're not limited to, but they include principles of humanity, of impartiality, neutrality, and independence. Now, these are issues that we really could discuss. Is that possible, or is it always desirable to be neutral, or is it at all possible? These are a dilemma, in fact, also for researchers. I recommend this guideline developed by the Interagency Standing Committee, which consists of most UN agencies and many other organizations. These recommendations give a lot of help in conducting research in emergency settings. Although the topic here is mental health and psychosocial support, it is applicable to many other topics. What makes it particularly interesting is that mental health and psychosocial issues are very sensitive to people, so it opens up for considerations and dilemmas about doing research on personal and sensitive topics. At the beginning of this guideline, you find some do's and don'ts on research in humanitarian settings. For example, do deliver immediate and direct benefit to communities, but do not do research with no benefit to communities. So this is not the time to do basic research. This is the time to look at immediate needs, and that is the core of a humanitarian setting. And this also has implications for what type of research should be done. Research should actually be based on existing gaps in the current knowledge, and we should not replicate or duplicate previous research, although evaluation is always necessary. We also have to do a thorough risk and benefit assessment and mitigate and make plans to mitigate these risks. In any humanitarian setting, as in most other research, we have to consult with the communities about the topic, about compensation, about methods, about ways to do research, and not least about disseminating findings to make sure that those who contribute to research also get the results and get information about what was found. Even if there is no body to control a lot of the ethical regulations, these have to be adhered to and have to be done. So, for example, always obtain informed consent and make sure it's a valid and real informed consent. There are 2 pages of these do's and don'ts. I hope they're interesting to you. Another hint, another useful piece of advice here is to consider the safety of participants and researchers, so that their protection, their safety is more important than getting the research done. So always ensure safety as part of your risk assessment. And staff members, whether research assessment, need to undergo training and supervision to ensure that they are competent to carry out research in those settings. You have learned already a lot about the do no harm approach and the do no harm principles. of research. These are particularly important in humanitarian settings, of course, when resources are scarce and needs are great. Here are some examples of ways to try to practice the do no harm approach. For example, and collaborate with and consult with community members about cultural relevance, collaborate with people with lived experience for accessibility and participation. Make sure there is supervision of staff, whether in this case of mental health psychosocial support, but also of researchers and research assistants. Make sure that any information is actually accessible and understandable to people, and that there are referral mechanisms so that if you uncover needs, if you uncover particularly grave situations that need to be followed up, that you've thought through these beforehand. Fundamental to do no harm and to a research is respect for persons. So this includes the autonomy, informed consent, confidentiality, etc., including third party. So if we get information about somebody who did not give their informed consent, we know what to do about that. And these also go in humanitarian settings. Informed consent can be a particular dilemma in humanitarian settings, similar to in different cultural contexts other than our own. And I thought this quote was quite telling from Stop Stealing Our Stories article from 2010, where the researcher Linda Bartolome says, when I go into a horrendous camp, there's a refugee camp situation, as a white researcher, the people are so desperate for any form of assistance, they would agree to anything, just on the off chance that I might be able to assist. It makes asking for permission to interview them or take photographs a farce. What does informed consent mean in an isolated refugee camp with security problems and no proper interpreters? So this is a very strong statement, which I think is worth reflecting on. Should we do research in those situations? How should we go about it? Even if we do not have any material assistance or ways to help, the people we want to work with may believe we do, in which case we have to take that at face value and seriously. Here are some useful guidelines and that I hope you can use. And also I thought maybe some volunteer guidelines, even though not created for research, could be useful because they are created to deal with power differences. For example, considering the safety and security of staff and volunteers, and also researchers and research assistants, to look into the financial arrangements, to make sure that the tasks are what we do, so the questions we ask or the methods we use, that we're actually qualified to do it, that there's not too much, for example, that we are competent. If we're not competent to do a job in peacetime in our own country, we're not competent to do it in a humanitarian setting. To make sure there's supervision of even senior researchers may need supervision and support in those situations. Make sure we have a social media policy. Then you can watch this parody that sums up some of the problems with volunteering abroad with a lack of social media policy. Make sure that our skills are appropriate, and also consider that what we do may have an impact over time, also a negative impact, even if we don't see it straight away. I wanted to mention also that if you work in humanitarian situations, it is useful to have basic knowledge of how to meet and support people in crises. And I recommend the psychological first aid manual for that, which underlines how to promote safety, calm, practical help, provide information, and connect people to their loved ones and to information and services. The psychological first aid manual exists in different formats, and also in different languages. And basic psychological first aid skills, meeting people in acute crisis, is useful for anyone who is going to meet people in crisis situations. And I wanted to mention also the duty of care for researchers and people we work with, the research assistants, for example. It is our duty to assess the situation so we do not put anyone in at increased risk, and that we mitigate risk situations. And this could not only be acutely, but also longer term. So, for example, the stress that people may encounter, or the suffering that they encounter, that could actually be quite harmful over time. So I'd like to recommend this well-being guide from the International Federation for the Red Cross, Red Crescent, on how to reduce stress and build inner resilience, which could be useful for anyone, with practical exercises and ways to handle stressful situations. And similarly, the Doing What Matters in Times of Stress guide, which exists also in many languages and has concrete steps on stress management, including on values and how to cope with prolonged stress situations. Here are some resources you may find useful, not always directly focusing only on research, but dealing with many of these issues. Similarly, here are some very good resources on partnerships and on some case studies from North-South research collaboration, which we can learn from. On that note, thank you very much. I look forward to speaking to you. Bye-bye.